Congress, Chapter 11. Here is the Capitol building. This is where Congress officially meets. There are offices where they do most of their work and committee hearings, rooms which are not in this building. If you go to this building as a tourist, what you're going to find is that's really what it is. It's like a tourist attraction. You can walk in here, you can see up into the rotunda. It is so large, if you've never been there, it is so large that the Statue of Liberty would fit inside. So here is the ground level, so to speak. Statue of Liberty would fit inside here and not hit the top of the rotunda. It's just massive. So there it is. There it is. All right. So what were the founders thinking when they created the Congress of the United States? So if you look at Madison, now remember Madison wrote the Constitution by and large. Yes, it was changed at the Constitutional Convention, but it was his idea, it was his theory. So in this Madisonian system of checks and balances, there would be this system of checks and balances and separation of powers. The reality with that is it would complicate policy making. You've got three branches of government, two of which are involved in the legislative policy making, and one of those branches is divided into two, meaning the House and Senate. Now, furthermore, not only is the legislature divided into two, but it is fragmented in that representation of elected officials, they're loyal to their constituents. So members of Congress are elected from districts, which we will get into later on, and they're going to be loyal to those districts because that is how they're going to get back in Congress. One senator said, speaking of Congress, he says, trying to move the Senate is like trying to push a wet noodle. It just doesn't happen. It's very slow. It's very cumbersome. And that is in part because they're going to be representative of their constituents, which is their state or their district. Now, congressional approval ratings have been low and in the single digits. We'll look at that here in the next slide. The outcome of the public view of Congress seems to be this: that individual members of Congress are doing what their constituents want, but Congress as a whole is not. And so you see that in this chart here. So here we are, clear back past 1992, when the approval rate of Congress back here was at 26%, jumped up to 40. It was at a high of 84%. And you can see here, we're at 18% in 2022, just 2 years ago. You might ask yourself, well, why were they so high right here? This was 9/11. This was 9/11. This is an effect of what political scientists call rally around the flag. Whenever there's a crisis that goes on, the president and Congress approval rating just tends to go up. And since then, you can see it's just steadily gone down. Little zigging and zagging, but mostly down. All right, so who are our members of Congress? What are their qualifications? You can see here what they are. So in order to be a senator, you've got to be at least 30 years old. You've got to have lived in the state you're going to represent for at least 9 years. And you've got to be an inhabitant of that state. So you've got to have resided in there and been an inhabitant of that state. The Senate, if you look at their term is 6 years long. And that is really what the founders were trying to do with that, is they were trying to get them to consider the long-term effects of policy. The 6-year term would kind of insulate them in that voters would be more likely to forget if they made some decision that was hard in the moment in order to move the country in the right direction. Whereas if you're a member of the House of Representatives, your term was 2 years, as you can see here. And that was designed to get the members of Congress to consider the short term. So you have these two different groups, and each of them have a task. At least that's how they were designed to do that. To be a member of the House, you've got to be at least 25 years old. You have to have been a resident for at least 7 years. And again, an inhabitant from the district, not just the state, but the district that you will represent. And again, that district will make more sense in a moment. And you've got to be... You obviously have to be a citizen, but you do not have to be a natural born citizen, meaning you do not have to have been born in the United States as a citizen. Immigrants can become members of the House, members of the Senate. That is not the case where the presidency is concerned, and we will get to that in the next chapter. Now, why aren't there more women in Congress? There are more men in Congress than women, and it's been that way since forever. Now, of course, early on when women couldn't vote, you would expect that there's not going to be the kind of women in Congress. But today, this is what's going on. So this is 2016. 38% of the House are female contestants. 47% of the Senate are female contestants. Now, one of the reasons there aren't more is because women with children just tend to be, and this is what your text says, less ambitious about running for office. I don't know whether I agree with that. I think what the text is saying, women as a whole are less ambitious about running for office, because obviously those women who run are ambitious about running for office. But what they're saying is their children limit their ability to run because they're their primary caretakers in many instances. All right. They are also less likely to run if they perceive that their odds are poor, which just tends to me to be a smart move, which we'll bring up that later again. It's not a good move to run if you're just going to lose. Women need a quality advantage to attract the independent male voters. You've got to, as we've said before, you've got to win the middle in order to win an election. And if you want to win, you've got to get more than the other side. And some of those obviously are going to be men. So women need some quality advantage to attract those male voters. Otherwise, the male voters will just vote males. All right. So if you look, this is a portrait of the 116th Congress. So there's a Congress every 2 years. Since members of the House are voted every 2 years, there is a, quote, new Congress every 2 years. So if you look at this chart, one of the things that becomes evident in here is that women are the most underrepresented. So there are 333 men that were voted in, that was 76%, and women voted in with 24%. Now you might look at this and say, well, wait a second, what about Hispanics? There are only, I'm sorry, this is not percent, this is which is close to that, okay? So 333 divided by the 435 members of the House of Representatives, it's actually 76.5%. So you can see why I made that error. So this is the House, this is the Senate. Now, Hispanics, there are 38 Hispanics in the 116th Congress. So let's just do a little math here and take a look and see how much that is. That is almost 9%. Almost 9%. Now, what about African Americans? African Americans is 12%. So you might say, well, wait a second, Christensen. 8% for Hispanics, 12% for African Americans. Aren't Hispanics the most underrepresented? You have to remember Hispanics account for about 15% of the population in the United States. So while they are underrepresented, they're not underrepresented as much as women. This is one of the questions on your test, your chapter test. Now, in the Senate, most groups are underrepresented because the constituency is the whole state. So that is just going to make it, it's just going to make it more difficult for minorities to win a seat in the Senate, because you're looking at, you've got to convince the whole state to vote for you, and it's going to be less diverse in a whole state than in a given district. All right. With congressional representation, there are certain approaches that candidates take as to what they perceive their role is in voting and in representing their members of their district. So one of those is descriptive representation. And this is the idea, it's rooted in the demographic characteristics of the representative with that of their constituents, with those of their constituents. So in other words, a male is representing a male, a female is representing a female, an African American is representing an African American. So it's the people who get voted in are like their constituents. All right? There's also the view of substantive representation. And that is the idea that there's a correspondence between a representative's opinion and those of their constituents. So in other words, I don't necessarily need to be of a particular religion to represent the members of that religion. Now, this little picture I have here, a woman candidate is not the same thing as a woman's candidate. So what this is saying is, even with descriptive representation, just because you're a woman does not necessarily mean you're going to represent what women think. So if more women think that abortion should be legal and this woman candidate does not, this criticism would apply. All right, now, one of the things that had happened with more women being elected to Congress is that there have been advances for women. Legislation is being passed that has been helping women. Pork barrel politics, this is the idea that Congress spends money to benefit a particular district or set of constituents, and this all comes back to this idea of descriptive representation. Now, so we're talking about, you've got to get the job to be a member of Congress. And so how do we do that? What does fair representation look like, or fair electoral politics look like? There are a number of problems related to fair representation or fair electoral politics. One of those is malapportionment. So malapportionment is the idea of having districts of greatly varying sizes. Now, this is in terms of population. So let me just jump ahead and we'll come back to these other two so you can understand this district thing better. So with Congress, what the Constitution required was that Congress be broken up for the House of Representatives into a given number of districts, because population was going to occur in Congress representation was going to occur in Congress based on population. So the larger states got more representation. So you can see here in these states, these different colors. So if we were to take Colorado here, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 districts. So what then would happen was there would be 6 elections. Each election would be for a given district. This is where we said, as a member of the House of Representatives, you have to live in that district. You couldn't run for this green district over here while living in this orange district. All right? So this idea, now let's go back. This idea, what if we had districts of greatly varying sizes? So in other words, what if, for example, you found a group of people and you just lumped them all together, and there were 3 million people in this district and only 500,000 in this district. The people in this district would have greater representation. That's the idea that is illegal. That is illegal these days. You cannot have districts of greatly varying sizes. Furthermore, there's something called gerrymandering, which is illegal. So a gerrymander is an election district which is drawn in a bizarre and unusual shape to favor a candidate or political party. And we're going to come back to that. You're going to see that. And the idea here is, can you manipulate these districts to make it easier, or in certain instances more difficult for a group to get elected? And if you do that, that is known as gerrymandering, and that is illegal. Now, one of the things that happens because of the Constitution, and it's a good thing, it all has to do with the House of Representatives and how representation will occur in these districts. Well, if it's based on population, population changes. And so what the Constitution requires is that every 10 years you have to count the population for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. And then seats are reapportioned based on that population. Now, what happened in the early years of the Republic was when population shifts occurred every 10 years, what Congress would do was they would add seats to Congress so no state would lose any representation, and the states that gain population relative to the other states would gain population. But the House of Representatives was getting so big that Congress said, hey, we've got to do something. So in 1920, they actually failed to reapportion. And there was a deadlock over the changing demographics of urban and rural population. And then finally in 1929, Congress said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to keep adding. We're going to fix the size of the House of Representatives at 435. So with this reapportionment now every 10 years, some states will lose seats, and other states will gain seats. That's how it works. So when I was a kid growing up, the state with the most members of the House of Representatives was New York, and based on demographic trends, I remember as an elementary school kid, they told us, and of course I was living in California, they said one day California is going to have the most, and they were right. Now it's interesting. California is actually, based on the last population, has actually lost one or two of these seats. That's reapportionment. That's what's going on. All right, so in 1910, in 1920, the size of a congressional district, this is the average size, 241. Today, it's up to 761,179. This is a major change. When the Constitution was first established, one member of the House of Representatives represented about 30,000 people. So the question becomes, can such a large constituency be represented by a single member of the House of Representatives? You could ask the same thing about the Senate, but remember, it's in the House of Representatives where, quote, representation of individuals is supposed to occur. Well, at the time the Constitution went into effect, you really didn't have congressional offices where they would have a staff. Now, most congressional and representative offices, they have got one in their district, and they've got another one in Washington, D.C. The computer allows them to do things that representatives early on would have never even imagined. So I think there's representation going on there, more so than you could imagine. 30,000 people for one person was probably too much way back when. So there's certainly technological aids that have helped members of the House of Representatives serve their constituents. All right, so we've already talked about this. We've already shown you what this is and what it's for. So let me just point out a couple more things, though. You can see here's the state of Wyoming. Here's Montana. there's only one member of the House of Representatives here, just because their population is so low relative to the other states. So that's what's going on. That's what's going on there. So let's take a look here at some congressional districts in California. So you can see here here are all the congressional districts in California. And you can also see here, so this is where I live, Chino Hills. You can see here that this district kind of meanders around and comes down here into a little bit of Orange County and grabs this. So why is it such a bizarre shape? Why is it such a bizarre shape? Just kind of hold that under your head for a second. So let's go back to this idea of gerrymandering. So remember what gerrymandering is: drawing election lines in bizarre or unusual shapes to make it easy for someone to be elected. So there was this guy by the name of Elbridge Gerry, and he wanted a political candidate to be elected. So he drew this election district in such a way as to make sure the ideological orientation of his candidate was consistent with those of his district or potential district. And a newspaper guy by the name of Thomas Nash, he took that district. He added the fangs and stuff on the wings, and he called it the gerrymander, since Elbridge Gerry had done this, and the term stuck. And so the idea here is, remember what we said way back somewhere, right here, that gerrymandering is illegal. So let's go back here and let's look at this stuff right here. Let's look at another district. So here is the 38th Congressional District, or at least it was when I created this slide. All right, so you look at it. Here's Pomona, La Puente. You can see it comes out clear to Downey. 605 is gonna get some of the Cerritos area, and this is a predominantly Hispanic district. And if you know anything about this district, ideologically speaking, more liberal, more Democrat. And you can see here, it certainly appears to be this bizarre or unusual shape. Now, is it gerrymandered? Maybe, maybe not. Let's look at another district. Here is the 47th Congressional District. And is it gerrymandered? By its shape, it certainly doesn't appear to be so. So is there a difference? And if there is a difference, what is the difference? Well, remember that each district must be roughly the same size, and size in this case means population, as any other district. So you're going to get some bizarre shapes trying to make these districts roughly the same size. And when I say the same size, what I mean is within a handful of numbers. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's how close they want these districts in size. So you see here in the greater Los Angeles area, this is where much of the population of California is. These districts are going to be quite small geographically, but this district right here, 32, is going to be the same size as District 41 of California, because as far in terms of population, because they have to be, that is law. Then you have District 43 here that is, again, meandering around. So this District 41 is this massive geographical one, and 43 just seems to cut up into it. So is it gerrymandered? Well, in one sense, you can argue that they're all gerrymandered to get that number, but are they gerrymandered to get a political outcome? Yes, it certainly seems so, right? Okay, this one again, the shape seems a little more, quote, normal, whatever normal means. So there are some other rules with these districts. Districts must be contiguous. That means that they can't be separated. You can't have one part of a district here separated by lots of things and another part of the district over here. So the districts has got to be one intact unit. All districts, as I've just said, must be as nearly as possible the same size, meaning population. And then gerrymandering is illegal. So because of these things, you are going to have some bizarre and unusual shapes. The question becomes, what is the motivation? What is the motivation? Now, has there been gerrymandering? If you look at this chart was Congress from 1968 to 1994. Why did I choose these dates? Well, in 1994, the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, meaning there were more Republicans in the House of Representatives than there were Democrats, and so they took over the leadership roles. And they did this. The Republicans did this for the first time in 40 years. So if you look at the percentage of the popular vote that the House Republicans got in all these years, you see here in 68, they got 48% of the vote, but only 44% of the seats. One of the most egregious examples here, they got 42% of the vote and only 32.9% of the seats. And so you can see here, it certainly looks like there has been gerrymandering going on in across the nation for all these years, because House Republicans were getting so much more of the popular vote than they were of the seats. So it looked like what had happened was that their strength was being lumped into certain groups in an attempt to give Democrats more strength overall. Then in 1994, there was finally the switch. So is that evidence of gerrymandering? It certainly is suggestive that there is gerrymandering. It is difficult to prove, though, because it is a state legislature that decides what these districts will be. But there it is. Here's a couple more. Again, this one looks pretty decent. Why is this part going in here? Again, you've got to have the same population size, the whole bit. And this one, again, why is it snaking around? But you've got to have the same population size. All right. Majority-minority districts are districts that are drawn to make it easy for a minority candidate to get elected. In 1982, Congress passed, President Reagan signed the Voting Rights Act of 1982, and one of the things that it did was it encouraged states to draw election districts to allow minorities a better chance of being elected, particularly since they had been discriminated against in the past. And so, in an effort to do that, North Carolina did that. This is one of the districts in North Carolina. You can see this district to give you an idea of how big that district is as far as geography. You have to look at this slide right here. This is that black district here we saw, meaning this color black, is this green one right here. You can see it just meandering along. Again, this red district, same kind of idea. What is going on here? Now, it certainly seems that they're carving out things to make it easier for some candidate to get elected, as opposed to here's a group, here's a part of the state. It just seems to be a little more geographically consistent, because we're just not going through neighborhoods carving them up. Okay, so what happened was individuals, members of the House of Representatives who lost their seats in this new congressional districting sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court in Shaw versus Reno. And what the Supreme Court said was that district right here, it meandered along for 160 miles was an example of political apartheid, which amounted to a racial gerrymander. So in other words, they did what the 1982 Voting Rights Act said to do, but again, they're just going through carving things up, making it easier to get elected. But the court's saying, is that what is required by the Constitution? And the court is saying, no, this is a racial gerrymander, and that's just as bad as trying to make a district in a Republican district or a Democratic district. Now, in 2001, the Supreme Court did a little backpedaling, and they said that race was not an illegitimate consideration in drawing congressional districts as long as it was not the dominant and controlling factor. So certainly you could try to do what the Voting Rights Act of 1982 said to do, but you didn't want to do this. You just didn't want to go through snaking things out. Otherwise, we're going to become a political apartheid where everything is based on race. Not a good idea, as you can see from things that are happening even in the United States today. All right, congressional elections, winning elections. There's something known as the incumbency advantage. The incumbent is the individual who already holds the political office. They find it much easier to get elected than their challengers. Why? Why is it so much more easy? In fact, the most predictable aspect of congressional elections is that incumbents usually win. If you get elected to Congress, it is likely that you're going to be able to stay in Congress as long as you want, if you just do a decent job. In 2016, only 7 House incumbents lost general elections. 5 others lost in primary elections, but those were because of redistricting. They didn't win their district primary election because their district was so much different than it was before. In the House of Representatives, more than 90% of incumbents usually win elections, and they win by more than 60% of the vote. The Senate is more competitive because it is the entire state at play, but that is what goes on any given congressional election every 2 years. So if you look at this chart right here, the blue represents the Senate, and the red represents the House. So you can see here, the House, every once in a while it dips. Something's going on, right? But you can see here, many times it's even over the 90%, almost 100% here. When things happen, there's sometimes backlash, but that's what it is. So right here, 1980 is when Reagan gets elected. A lot of Democrats were put out and a lot of Republicans came in. But then with the Senate, and the Senate bounces around more as we suggested. Okay, moving on. What are the advantages of incumbents? Why is it they find it so much easier to get elected? So incumbents find it much easier to advertise themselves. They are visible within their district. They have a database that helps keep track of what constituent interests are, who their constituents are, what they believe in, what causes are important to them. And so it makes it much easier for the incumbent to advertise him or herself. They also are involved in constituent services, which is casework. They help their constituents cut through the red tape of laws and solve problems for them, and that makes their constituents more loyal to them. There's also something known as the franking privilege, which is essentially free mail for members of Congress that they can mail out to their constituents, quote, tell them what they are doing in trying to represent them. And this is a major gift to them. It would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $750,000 to send out one group of mailing to members of your district as a member of the House of Representatives. And so for an incumbent, that's going to be free. But a challenger is going to have to raise that money. Another effect or advantage of incumbency is the incumbent is able to claim that they were able to win federal funds for their district. Now, they can claim it. It may or may not be true, but they certainly claim it even if it isn't true. So when Congress passes a budget and money comes back to a district or a state to build a highway, to build a school, to improve something, members of Congress will basically claim, I did that. I brought this money back. And so individuals will say, oh, well, we want this individual in our corner, and we'll continue to vote for them. They also, we talked about pork barrel spending earlier. They also get contracts for their districts that bring jobs and money back to their districts. All right. Weak opponents. Another advantage of incumbency is that there are usually weak opponents. These strong advantages of incumbents typically scare off more competent, capable candidates because they know it is almost impossible to beat incumbents. And so it just scares them off. Furthermore, challengers usually suffer from inadequate funding to compete with the incumbents. So incumbents find it easier to raise money. These guys don't. Everybody knows if they vote for them, if they donate money to them, it's probably wasted money because they're not going to win anyway. And so that makes it even that much more difficult for challengers to raise money. A fourth advantage of incumbents. Just with this ability to raise money, they are able to spend more. So the average winner in the 2015-2016 election cycle for the House of Representatives spent $1.5 million. For the Senate, $10.5 million. Incumbents are always campaigning. Everywhere they go, they're campaigning. So for a member of the House of Representatives, they're campaigning for 2 years. Everything is with an idea on the next election and raising money for the next election. The fifth is party identification. Most members of Congress, because of that districting that we've just talked about, represent districts that are clearly one-sided, meaning clearly Democrat or clearly Republican. These are known as safe seats. The congressional districts which are drawn usually reinforce that. And we've seen that. I've shown you that. And with this idea that congressional districts must be equal size, it just makes it so it's that much easier to gerrymander in favor of one political party as opposed to another. And that's really just what has happened. So when is it that a congressional candidate can be defeated? When somebody runs against a congressional incumbent, it is just bad advice. They're just very unlikely to win. So when is it that somebody should run? Well, that is when there's an open seat. An open seat is somebody has retired, somebody has died. And so there's no incumbent. Those are the seats that are going to be possible for someone to win. Now, there are some advantages of having incumbents, having the same person in over and over again. That allows for stability, and it allows for the individual to gain expertise in a field within the legislature. So members of the legislature are assigned to congressional committees, which we'll get to it here in a minute, and that allows for them to gain this expertise and move up within the committees. A term limit requirement would increase turnover in Congress and increase this rotation in and out. Then that also might hurt this expertise that we've just talked about. So there's three likely reasons, or the reasons that are most likely to cause a defeat for an incumbent. And that one is a scandal or corruption. That can lead to an incumbent's defeat. So when there's a scandal, corruption, then you're going to get some serious contenders coming in because they realize, hey, I can win this thing. Another reason is when there's congressional redistricting, that makes incumbents that were formerly part of a district where their district has fundamentally changed, that makes them susceptible to defeat as well. And then there are political tidal waves like you saw back here when Reagan got elected, that make some shift in the electorate and make it possible for someone to beat the incumbent. All right, so so let's shift gears for a minute. We've talked about Congress and how to get there and who wins and all that. Now let's talk about why a Congress. Why did why did the Founding Fathers choose a Congress? They could have chosen a parliament. So what is a Congress? It is a legislative body, and if you were to look this up, there'd be a reference to the United States, composed of a House of Representatives and a Senate. Okay, a parliament, on the other hand, is a legislative body fused with an executive. So let me show you what I mean by that. All right, so in a parliament, this is visually what it would look like. You have the legislature and the executive are one. So what happens in a parliament after elections, you don't vote for individual members of the legislative body, you vote for a party. Whichever party gets the most, they choose out of their party members who they want to be the executive to be. So there is a committee, so to speak, within the legislature or within parliament that operates as the executive function. So the legislature and the executive are fused with the parliament. Well, I think you can already see why the Founding Fathers didn't choose this, because they saw the government of England was too powerful, and so they didn't want that. And so what they did was they separated the powers of government into these three independent branches, and I don't have the judicial lifted up here, but you've got the legislative branch and the executive branch, which are distinct and separate. Not only that, the elections ensure that. We have one election for members of the legislature, we have another election for members of the executive. Now, this thing moved on me. Let me see if I can move it back where it goes. There it is. There it is. That's what it should look like. So there are some overlapping powers within the congressional system, and the founders set it up that way. They wanted them to be separate and distinct, but they wanted overlapping powers so there could be checks and balances. So Congress has the power to make law, but in this overlapping area, the president has the right, or the executive has the right, to sign that into law or to veto it. So you can see there's a difference there with what is going on, where with a parliament, you always have a legislative majority because the executive is part of the legislature, and that executive is going to be chosen from the majority party. With a Congress, you do not always have a legislative majority. So for instance, right now in the House of Representatives, Biden does not have a majority. He does in the Senate. Democrats are not in the majority in the House of Representatives, so that even makes this division of powers a little more problematic for the president, because he can't just get what he wants. And this is exactly what the Founding Fathers wanted. They wanted there to be that check and balance. All right, so what were the objectives of the framers in creating Congress? They wanted to oppose this concentration of power into a single institution, and I think you can understand that better now that we've gone over this idea. They also wanted to balance the large and small states, the free and slave states. This was going on, and that balance actually ended up working to the advantage of the United States as a whole. Now, slaves paid a great cost for that, but this idea that now we represent, in a sense, large states in the Senate large states in the House of Representatives and small states in the Senate because they're represented based on equality. That's what happened there. Congress, believe it or not, was designed by the framers to be the dominant branch of government. You may not think so based on the amount of coverage that the president gets, but that's what the founders wanted. They wanted the Congress to be the dominant branch of government. They wanted that because they didn't want any one single individual having that much power. And so that's what they did. All right, moving on. So in the Congress, so we're going to make the Congress the dominant branch of government. Well, but we don't want it to be too powerful. So what do? Let's divide it in two. And so you've got the House of Representatives and you've got the Senate. And as we've just intimated, in the House of Representatives, representation is based on population. The more individuals you have in your state, the more representation you're going to have in Congress. Power is centralized in the body itself. In the body of the House of Representatives, power is centralized. That is because of the large numbers. So leadership in the House has much more power than leadership in the Senate. The presiding officer of the House is known as the Speaker of the House. And they are the most powerful member of the House of Representatives, in part because power is more centralized in the Senate. The majority leader's primary partisan ally the Speaker of the House's primary partisan ally would be what is called the majority leader. And this is just going to be one of the leaders of whichever political party has the majority. And it's probably going to be next in line to become Speaker of the House. Not necessarily, but it's certainly up there in consideration. All right, in the Senate, the representation method is state equality. Each state, regardless of size, gets 2 senators. This is where, again, going back here, this is where we balance the large and small states. We give each state, regardless of size, 2 senators. Power is decentralized, and it's more in the hands of the individual senators just because of their smaller numbers. The presiding officer, in reality, is the majority leader. Now, why do I say the presiding officer in reality is the majority leader? That is because the Constitution names the vice president as the president of the Senate. This is really a ceremonial leader. And ironically, this is the vice president's only duty per the Constitution, to be the president of the Senate. What their function is to vote in the event of a tie in the Senate, because with 2 senators per state, there was always going to be the reality that there could be a tie, and there has been. And the vice president has voted to break the tie. All right. Congress and committees. So way back when, we said we were going to come back to committees. So you have 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate. That's a lot of people, particularly in the House, to get them to go in a single direction. Furthermore, there's a lot more work that Congress does than you could have one body doing. So what Congress does is they break themselves into committees. Woodrow Wilson, I say here, Professor Woodrow Wilson, says that Congress in session is Congress on display. Congress in committee is Congress at work. Now, why do I make a big deal out of Professor Woodrow Wilson? Well, he would become president of the United States, but he was also a professor of government at Princeton. And this is what he said about Congress. He says, when you go and you see Congress in session, that's just Congress on display. But when they're in committee, they're at work. And so Congress has divided their workload by dividing themselves into committees. Now, with that, they were able to specialize. There are over 200 committees and subcommittees in Congress. And this is where they specialize, and this is why one of the reasons why it's important for a member to hang around Congress for longer, because usually the way an individual is assigned to a committee is one based on interest, another based on constituent needs, and finally, how long they've been around, how long they've been in the body of Congress itself. There are several types of committees. There are standing committees, and standing committees are permanent committees. These are going to be around. There are joint committees, and there are members of. So these standing committees are joint committees, meaning members from both political parties are there. Let me restate something there. So standing committees are permanent committees, and there are members of both political parties on them. If your party is in the minority, you're going to have fewer members, basically based on the percent you got members of the House of Representatives or members of the Senate. That's the percent you're going to have in the committee. But joint committees, there are members of both political parties on them, but they're formed for a special purpose. And really can only report out a bill. We'll get to that when we get to how a bill becomes a law. A conference committee is used to reconcile differences in a House and Senate version of the bill. We'll get to that as well. And then there are ad hoc or special or select committees, which are temporary committees, which often perform investigative functions. Now I have here a note. House Select Committee on Benghazi. Let me just jump to the end here. Oh, nope, not quite the end. So there was, if you've ever seen the movie 13 Hours, there was, and well, it was called different things. The Democrats claimed that it was a reaction to a movie. Based on these committee hearings, it certainly didn't seem to think that. Really good movie if you want to watch that, and then you can look up some stuff on YouTube to watch them in this congressional hearing. You see Jim Jordan really going after Hillary Clinton, and you can see here from this pose of Hillary Clinton, she is not impressed. And yeah, that's just how it was. Really kind of interesting. All right, so so that's that. Let's move on. We'll get to what I was talking about. Now, committees are organized by party and by seniority, as I just kind of intimated. Whichever party has a majority in Congress, they're going to get that same majority on the committee. So if one party has 55% of the seats in the House and the other 45, that's about the percent they're going to get on those committees. Whoever is the majority party will chair, whichever party is, they will chair that party. So right now in the House of Representatives, the Republicans have a majority, just a slight majority, and so they're going to have every chair for every committee is going to be Republican. If in the next elections the Democrats gain the majority, that will flip-flop and it will become Democrats. Committee chairs generally selected by seniority, so the longest-serving member of the political party in the majority will become the committee chair. There you go. So what is it that committees do? There are different types of committees, and so I want to talk about three of those. One is authorizing committees. Authorizing committees tell the bureaucracy what to do. So you have this vast bureaucracy under the presidency, and they tell them, okay, you've got to do this. They create them and tell them what to do. All right. They are also, authorizing committees are also responsible for congressional oversight. So that frame I just showed you with Jim Jordan and Hillary Clinton, that was congressional oversight, where they were questioning the administration on what they had done and why they had done it. Since 1961, only about 8% of congressional hearings were this oversight function. 20 years after that, 25% of hearings are now oversight functions. It's probably even gone up a little more since then. But basically a quarter of what Congress does is this congressional oversight, and that is done through these authorizing committees. Appropriations Committee. In the House, it is called an Appropriations Committee. In the Senate, it is called the Finance Committee. Now, they decide how much money the government can spend. Furthermore, if there is some piece of legislation that says we're going to do something, these Appropriations Committee or Finance Committee can really undo that. So when Trump was president, they voted to build the wall, the Great Wall of America, authorized $60 billion to do it. But will the money be appropriated? And some of it was. So these appropriations committees or finance committees are very powerful because they can, in effect, undo what other committees have done by simply not paying for it. The House Rules Committee establishes the rules for the House. It assigns the number of staff each congressional individual receives and determines what rules the bill will be debated under and the length of the debate. So based on those rules, they can make more favorable rules or less favorable rules, and that will make it more likely or less likely that a bill will pass and become law. They also schedule legislation for voting. So members of the House Rules Committee, very powerful because they can change the dynamics of things based on what rules they establish for these issues right here. So this comes out of your text. I realize it is hard to see, but this is the process by which a bill becomes a law. And I'm just going to go through this really quickly. There's not any questions asked on the chapter test, but it's something you ought to understand. So at any rate, we'll just go through it. So when a bill is introduced, it's given to the House, it's given to the leadership of the House, it's actually placed in what's known as a hopper, and then it gets assigned to a subcommittee. The subcommittee usually it gets assigned to a committee. The committee usually assigns it to a subcommittee. And then if the bill is progressing, there's legislative hearings, there's testimony brought in by from experts on both sides of the bill. There are votes taken as to whether or not it should move forward. If it moves forward, there might be what's called a markup session where based on the testimony of these experts, language of the bills is changed to deal with some of the concerns of the experts. Then it gets voted on. If it passes, it goes to the full committee. From the subcommittee, it goes to the full committee, and that process starts over again. And then the subcommittee would, again, go through that process. If it moves forward and passes the subcommittee, it goes to the full House. Now notice, if it passes the House and it hasn't gone through the Senate, then it shoots up to the Senate or vice versa. If it passes the House and then it also passes Senate, the two bills are going to be different by the time they've gone through this process. This is where I said back earlier in the lecture that there's going to be a conference committee. In this conference committee, you're going to have individuals from both sides of the aisle, again, based on the percent of what they control in Congress. So if Democrats are in 55% control of the Senate and Republicans are in 51% control of the House, that number is going to be roughly the same here. If it passes this conference committee, then it goes back both to the House and the Senate, meaning they would have to reconcile the differences in the two versions of the bill. Then it goes back to the House and the Senate. If both the House and the Senate vote to approve it, then it goes to the president to become law. If you've ever seen the video Schoolhouse Rock, it does a pretty good job in how a bill becomes a law. Obviously not quite as detailed as I just gave. All right, so the legislative process. There are some other things that I didn't talk about that I want to talk about now. So the House has limited debates. The reason being there are 435 members of the House. They've got to set a limit, otherwise they'll never get through it. And ironically, usually that limit, so when a bill gets to the full House, usually that limit is very short, 2 hours. But the Senate has because of their smaller size, a tradition of unlimited debate emerged. That led to what has become known as the filibuster, which is essentially an attempt to talk a bill to death. And that has happened a number of times. There has been in the Senate some attempts to deal with this idea of the filibuster, where a group of senators that don't like a bill just want to talk it to death, because the Senate will only take up one thing at a time, and if they don't get off this bill, nothing else gets done. So there's something that was created known as a motion for cloture, and that is a vote to end debate in the Senate. Today, originally the motion for cloture took 66 senators to vote to end debate. Now it's down to 60 senators to vote to end debate. That is known as a motion for cloture. Now, what happens if it, as a bill goes through this process of going through the committee? What happens if a bill just kind of dies out in committee and doesn't do anything? So the chair of a committee that didn't like a bill, he could bottle it up in committee. He or she could bottle it up in committee by just not holding hearings and never taking a vote on it. But what if members of the House or members of the Senate, where there was a bill like that, wanted to hear or wanted to come to the merits of a bill? In the House, they could vote with what is known as a motion for discharge to bring the bill to the full House. And that would take a vote of at least 218, which is one more than half, to bring the bill out of committee and go before the entire House. And again, the same idea in the Senate is known as a discharge petition, and it takes 51 senators at least voting to bring that to the full Senate for debate. Now, this is a good law, because if you can get half the people want to come to the merits, there's a chance for it to pass. If you can't get half, it's not going to pass. So good law. Well done, Congress. All right. Yeah, we've just covered that. All right, we've covered this one where we're talking about congressional oversight, and one last one, and then you'll be done. All right, so congressional caucus. A caucus is a conference of members of the legislative body who belong to some particular faction or interest. So the members that have a common interest will often come together and form a caucus to influence policy involving what their mutual interest is. So here I've listed, or I've got 4 pictures, which are the symbols of 4 of the caucuses in Congress. So you have the Congressional Black Caucus, you have the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, you have the Democratic Women's Caucus, and you have the House Freedom Caucus. So there's Congress itself, but individuals within Congress will form groups to advance interests that they have and that their constituents have. And these caucuses do that. Now, sometimes they cause problems too. Like right now, the House Freedom Caucus is causing all sorts of issues for the House Speaker. So they can be troublemakers as well. All right. I hope that is helpful. I hope you do well on these tests, and hope this is helpful in allowing you to do that.